Hello everyone and welcome back. In this new lesson we are going to start the implementation of our messages service. This is going to be the observable based service that we are going to be using to interact with our error messages component from multiple parts of our Angular application. Let's start by creating here a new messages service.ts file here in our messages directory. So this is going to contain our observable based service. Let's define here a new class. We're going to be calling it messages service, and let's, as usual, make this an Angular injectable. And just like the case of the loading indicator service, we are not going to be declaring this as a global singleton. There could be different messages services in our application, each one linked to a particular component. We're going to be having one messages service here linked to the application root component, but we are also going to have a second instance of the messages service here in our edit course dialog so that we can display errors directly here on the dialog. Let's now create a pair of instances of the messages service and of our messages component. We are going to switch back here to our application root component, and we're going to be adding the messages component right here below the material toolbar. So below this red bar that we see here on top, we're going to be adding here a new instance of the messages component. In order to be able to interact in a decoupled way with this instance of the messages component, we are going to need an instance of the messages service that is accessible at this point of the Angular component tree. So if we open here our application component file, we're going to be adding here, next to the loading service, a new instance of the messages service. We could even inject this instance of messages service here directly in the constructor if we wanted to. But more important than that, this instance of messages service that we are creating here is going to be accessible to the application component template and to all its child components, including the messages component that we have created here. For example, the home component that we see here and that is going to be placed here instead of the router outlet could potentially need to show an error message to the user. Let's say that, for example, something goes wrong here whenever we try to load the courses. In that case, we would like to display here an error message to the user. In order to do that, we can go ahead and inject here in our constructor an instance of the messages service. And using this shared service is how the home component can interact in a decoupled way with the messages panel. Actually, the home component does not know even with which messages panel it's interacting with. It has no way of knowing that the messages panel that is going to be displaying the error message sits here on the top root component of the application. All that this home component knows is that it received here a messages service on its constructor, and it's via this service that we can show somehow error messages to the user. Let's now define the public API of the messages service. So what a component like the home component would need in order to show messages to the user is a public method that we're going to be calling here show errors. This is going to receive as its only input parameter an errors array, which is going to be an array of strings. Whenever the home component, for example, needs to display to the user a list of errors or even a single error message, all we have to do is call this method and the messages service is going to take care of everything. Let's give you an example. Let's imagine that here something went wrong while loading all the courses from the backend. In that case, the first thing that we need to do is to somehow catch the error here in our observable chain. So for that, we're going to be using here the catchError RxJs operator. Here, as the input argument of catchError, we are going to be receiving the error that the application has thrown. And here, as the output of this function, we need to provide a new observable that is going to replace the failed observable. We also want to call the messages service and inform the user that something went wrong. Let's start by defining here the error message that we want to show. We're going to define here a new constant called message, and we're going to assign it the message could not load courses. Let's now, before anything else, use the messages service and show this message to the user. Using this show errors input argument, we can pass in one or more strings as input separated by commas. In our case, we are only passing one message. Now we also want to log to our browser console and place there some trace that something went wrong. So we are going to log both the error message, but we are also going to log the technical error that we have received here. Notice that we are not necessarily displaying this error to the user because it might not make sense to the user. Now here, as the output of this method, as we have mentioned before, we need to return here a new observable that is meant to replace the observable that has errored out. So this observable highlighted here. Now in our case, we don't really want to replace the source observable with a new observable. We want to instead terminate our observable chain. So for that, we are going to be returning here a new observable using the throw_error factory method, and we're going to pass it the error that was received here on catchError. So throw_error is going to create a new observable that immediately emits the error and it ends its life cycle. So effectively, we are terminating here our observable chain. Yes, we are replacing this observable with another observable, but that new observable is going to immediately error out with the same error. So it's not like load all courses was replaced with a new observable that continued to emit values over time. What we did here with throw_error was to make sure that the observable chain is terminated. And with this we have added here some error handling to our home component. Now the question is, how will the messages service now make this list of errors available to the messages component? Let's learn on the next lesson how can we implement this functionality using a reactive approach.